Unlock the power of your mind. This is Provocative Enlightenment with Eldon Taylor.
Welcome and thank you for joining us today. The next hour is devoted to learning something more, not just about the world of shoes and ships and sealing wax, but about how, what, and why we believe as we do. A time for those willing to question what they think they know or what they may believe, those willing to be uncertain for an hour. I'm Eldon Taylor, and this is Provocative Enlightenment. All right, our chat room is open, and my partner, Ravinder, well, she awaits you there every week. You can log on by going to provocativeenlightenment.com/chat. We do have a wonderful chat room with some super people, so Ravinder, would you like to tell us about the glorious nature of your chat room?
It's a glorious chat room indeed. There are some great people in there, and they always teach me a lot. We have a fun conversation going on in there most of the time. Sometimes it's humorous, oftentimes it's educational. I always get extra tips in there, so it's really cool. So if you can join us, we would love to have you. That is at provocativeenlightenment.com/chat. But please do not come in if you are driving or if your boss is close, because they can get kind of snarky sometimes. So do come in and join us, provocativeenlightenment.com/chat. If you can't come in live, you can always check it out after the event, and then you'll get to see any URLs or anything that we have posted there, any additional information that may assist you in your own journey. See you there.
All right. This week I wish to discuss cruelty, for there are many forms of this nasty vice that currently infect almost everything we encounter. Whenever I turn on a cable news network, no matter which one, there is one message always conveyed. It is the message of us versus them. It seems that news as we used to know it, a decade or more ago, has died. There appears to be an agenda that accompanies the news and colors it accordingly. Question: is the us against them a form of cruelty? I think so. There are many psychological experiments that have repeatedly demonstrated the abuses possible with this mentality. Take, for example, the infamous Robbers Cave experiment. Lucifer Sheriff, a social psychologist who carried out this experiment, his main contribution is known as realistic conflict theory. He demonstrated that conflict between groups occurs when two groups are in competition. The events at Robbers Cave mimic the kinds of conflict that plague people all over the world. The simplest explanation for this conflict is competition. Assign strangers to groups, throw the groups into competition, stir the pot a little, and soon there is conflict. There is a lot of evidence that when people compete for scarce resources or ideas, such as jobs, land, political choices, etc., there is a rise in hostility between groups. For example, in times of high unemployment, there may be high levels of racism among white people who believe that non-whites or asylum seekers have taken their jobs. Is competition therefore cruel? And that's a fair question. From my perspective, there is always competition, and it, in and of itself, is not cruel, but how we respond may be. Let's look at another in-and-out group, the classic story told in Lord of the Flies. This is a story of two groups of boys who war with one another over questions of rule and morality. At an allegorical level, the central theme is the conflicting human impulses towards civilization and social organization, living by the rules peacefully and in harmony, and toward the will to power. Themes include the tension between groupthink and individuality, between rational and emotional reactions, and between morality and immorality. Then we have the classic study known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. Again, we see a division among students occur and brutality ensue. I could go on, but is it anything but cruel when we so divide ourselves against another group that we no longer think of them as worthy of our respect. Our current political landscape is tearing our nation apart, and we aid in this every time we distinguish ourselves as separate, belonging to the preferred group. In a sense, this is not much different than the behavior of youngsters who mock other children, deriding them with ridicule, shaming them for being a little different, and so forth. Have we forgotten this lesson and failed to recognize that our behavior may not be too much different today? Cruelty comes in many forms, but it always begins by setting ourselves separate from another, usually above them. Oh, there are always rationalizations such as, they deserve it, but a rationalization is just that. It is not permission to be cruel and hateful. A poll on Facebook that I responded to this past week asked a simple question. What is the one thing that you think is wrong with our world? The answer for me was quick and easy. Hate. Cruelty is a form of hate, and it begets itself on all if we say nothing, do nothing, and allow its infectious nature to metastasize. So I may sound like a broken record sometimes, but once again, I urge you to set aside the hate and find a better way. For as Seneca once said, all cruelty springs from weakness. My thoughts anyway. What are yours, Ravinder?
You know, you've got a great deal of material there. I totally agree. There isn't any such thing as news anymore. I'm not certain that there ever was, but if there was, or if it wasn't before, it's just worse now because everything gets politicized. And I watch and I pay attention, and I can pick out the words that are designed to shift me into one direction or the other. But back to the whole idea of the us and them, I remember getting into real trouble once on the air because what I stated then was when you have the us and them mentality, that is where the seeds of evil lie. Now, at the time, the conversation was about Occupy Wall Street, and I wasn't taking a side in any direction. It was just you had these hard divisions. You know, you were either in the group or outside the group, and there was a great deal of friction going on between the two, and it was that very us and them mentality that was creating the violence and some of the problems that were going on. I do think us and them is where the seeds of evil lie. And so I would urge everyone out there, you know, don't think of others as being in a group. If someone's got a different opinion to you, they're not them. They've just got a different opinion. So why not talk about it and understand that we're all part of the us. We just have different ways of expressing ourselves, that's all.
Well, we have the perfect guest today to take this one, and pursue it as far as we can, and that's a man who has specialized in this area. But first, every week I read some of your letters as our way of involving you while paying respect to the very important role you play in making this show successful. Our last show featured Joshua Cooper Ramo, and we discussed his book and work, The Seventh Sense, Power of Fortune and Survival in the Age of Networks. John wrote, loved your guest, and I followed your urging to read his book. A great book indeed. Thanks for bringing him to your show. CB commented, very articulate guest, though the answers were lengthy. Wish we could have had more. Glenn wrote, I truly enjoyed the show with Joshua Cooper Ramo. Many of us are beginning to feel the alienation of the coming connectivity revolution and see evidence of the coming madness. We are becoming more connected every day, but have very little understanding of the new world into which we are running headlong. The powers that be have much invested into keeping the normal man asleep, unaware, and unwilling to awaken. I think we are seeing symptoms of the alienation of connectivity in the form of hypersensitivity to perceived insults and attacks. If you don't agree with me, then you are my enemy. It's a sort of digitally induced paranoia reinforced by impersonal, non-physical connectivity. Moving on, Tony wrote, your interviews bring so much information, enlightenment, and encouragement to my life. They really are life-changing. Peter wrote, I just want to thank Eldon Taylor for his way of spreading the knowledge. I found his videos about a month ago on YouTube when I was searching for anything about subliminal messages, and just love the way he speaks and transfers knowledge for others with stories and easy-to-understand language. Really, thank you. I got some of his books now, but I think the audio way is much better. I listened to all that I could find on YouTube and other places, and the way he explains stuff is great. It made me understand about a lot of things in life. Thank you. Okay, now for everybody out there, you should check out our YouTube channel. If you haven't already, you can find it at YouTube under Progressive Awareness. Gail wrote, I have your Empowering Intuition Inner Talk CD. It's great. And Robert wrote, there is no higher compliment that can be paid than for a patron to declare that your products actually work, and they are working for me. Okay, that's all the time we're going to take for letters today, but we do love your comments, so please keep them coming. You can opine by writing to me at Eldon, that's Eldon, at eldontaylor.com, or by joining me on Facebook at Dr. Eldon Taylor. We do sincerely appreciate your thoughts and ideas. Now to today's show, the psychology of compassion and cruelty, understanding emotional, spiritual, and religious influences with Professor Thomas G. Plante. So let me tell you a little about today's guest. Dr. Thomas G. Plante is the Augustine Cardinal Bea, S.J. University professor and professor of psychology at Santa Clara University, and adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Stanford University School of Medicine. He has served as psychology department chair, acting dean of the School of Education, counseling psychology, and pastoral ministries, and director of the Spirituality and Health Institute at Santa Clara University. He has authored, co-authored, edited, or co-edited 21 books, and he has been featured in numerous media outlets, including Time Magazine, CNN, NBC Nightly News, the PBS NewsHour, New York Times, USA Today, British Broadcasting Company, National Public Radio, on and on, among many others. Okay. On that, and through the magic of Skype, let's get him in here. Welcome to Provocative Enlightenment, Professor Thomas Plante.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be with you.
I really enjoyed the book, The Psychology of Compassion and Cruelty. It is a fantastic read. When I picked the book up, it seems like it's a textbook, but where it has that kind of quality, it also has, I think, a universal appeal, an appeal that all of our listeners would find informative. Did you write it for the masses or just as a textbook?
Well, that's a great question. And usually in a lot of my book projects, particularly with this particular publisher, we try to bridge both the academic community and sort of the interested lay reader community. And so it was really written in a way that tried to be appealing to those who are interested in this topic, regardless of their background. But it also is used in classroom environments, and I use it as such here at Santa Clara University.
Well, it is a great read, and I recommend it to everyone. Professor, we like to know three things on this show. Who is the messenger? What is the message? And, of course, how do we use it? So let's begin by having you tell us about yourself and your interest in the subject of compassion and cruelty. Why that subject matter?
Well, as you said in your introductory comments, we seem to be living in a world that is rather cruel, and there's much evidence to suggest that we live in a world where it can be very quick for people to get to us versus them, the enemy versus my friend, and so forth. And I am here at Santa Clara, which is a Jesuit university. Much of the Jesuit universities across the country and world focus on issues of social justice, of compassion, of building a humane and just world. And as a practicing psychologist myself, I've certainly seen a wide variety of people who are struggling mightily with these kinds of issues. I also do a good deal of work with the Catholic Church regarding sex offending clerics, and certainly that has been a very hot topic in recent years, where both perpetrators and victims have struggled mightily. And so for a variety of reasons, the research that I do have found my way into the relationship between psychology and spirituality and religion. And we try to take, of course, an empirical approach trying to move the ball forward in our understanding of how can we create a world that's more compassionate, more humane, more connected. And the implications are enormous, as you know, because we live in a world that could implode, it seems like, at any minute. And there's a variety of things that we can do to make the world not do that. And I want to be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Well, and I think, for what it's worth, a little plug here. Your book is one of those instruments that can make that kind of a difference. So you do agree with me that this in and out mentality contributes to cruel behavior?
Absolutely, and I think there's an enormous amount of research. You quoted the famous Sharif study where they put pretty young kids. I mean, these kids were around middle school age, and they randomly assigned some kids to wear the blue shirt and some kids to wear the red shirt, and engage in competition. And very quickly, just based on the color of your shirt, you could get into an us versus them mentality. You also quoted the famous Zimbardo study at Stanford, the prison study that gets a lot of press, and it underscores how so easily one who is randomly assigned to either a prisoner condition or a prison guard condition can really engage in cruelty. We see this all the time. We see this at athletic events, for example. You either like the Boston Red Sox or you like the New York Yankees, but you can't like both. You like the in your area in Seattle. You either like the Seattle Seahawks or you like the San Francisco 49ers. You can't like both, and you very easily and quickly, even around things like sport and so forth, you can get into an us versus them mentality. They can get out of control pretty quick. And so we really want to put the brakes on some of that to see, as you said in your introduction, that we're in a community, not so much of us versus them, but we. It's always about we. And we may have different points of view about things. We may respectfully disagree about some things, but it's still we. And I think this is such an important concept that we really need to do all that we can to support it.
This is a bit of an aside, but I have to ask it, Professor. We recently learned, of course, that Russia didn't just meddle with an election, but they used, social networking platforms to divide people. They would post things that may or may not have been true. Usually there was a kernel of truth, but then the best lie is built on a kernel of truth, just to inflame people, just to divide people. And we seem to see that everywhere, not just in what Russia did, but in our own media, etc. Do you think there's some, I don't want to use the word conspiracy, but what on earth? I mean, why do you think this is going on in our culture today?
Well, I think there's a variety of reasons, and there's a variety of unintended consequences as well. So, for example, we live in a world today, as you know, where people either watch Fox News or they watch something like MSNBC. We don't have a shared news outlet. People watch one, perhaps, or the other, not necessarily both, just like you're rooting for one team or the other. We live in a political world, as you know, the Democrats versus the Republicans. Which side are you on? And what gets lost in these in this polarity, this divisiveness, is this whole notion of the common good. And we have lost that in our social media as well. We've lost that in our news. We've lost that in our politics. And sadly and tragically, whether this was intentional when some of these platforms started or not, that's been the outcome. And people have exploited it. And so when you mentioned about the Russian interference with our recent election, who would have guessed that something like Facebook, something that was just a way for example, I can stay in touch with my high school friends in Rhode Island now that I live in California, or people can stay in touch with people from their friends and family around the globe, has been used as an instrument for divisiveness to the point where it could throw an presidential election for the United States. This is just remarkable. And so people will unfortunately take new platforms, new media, and so forth, and sadly will turn them in a way to get some outcome that they want, even if it's a cruel outcome, an evil outcome, and doesn't support the common good. And who would have guessed this would have happened 10 years ago when Facebook entered into the scene? And who would have guessed this would have happened in the mid-90s when cable news started to become prevalent?
Right. Well, again, I suppose that's why I find your book so timely. So let's turn to that. We recently interviewed Dr. Joel Salinas on this show. He has mirror touch synesthesia and actually feels his patient's pain. Now, it's a rare condition. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but this is an example of true empathy. But compassion and empathy are not the same. So if we can, let's begin with a definition of empathy. And if you will, contrast it with compassion. Or actually, to say it differently, let's begin with a definition of compassion and contrast that to empathy.
Sure. Well, people will have different points of view about compassion, and not everyone who studies this area will be in complete agreement. But in a nutshell, we feel like it involves several steps. I mean, the first step is really to see and empathize or feel someone else's concern and pain. But then that second step is to actually do something about it, to try and console, try to help. Try to do something to alleviate that pain. And so we contrast that with straight empathy, which is, maybe feeling someone's pain, but you're really not necessarily going to do anything about it. You maybe feel bad for the person, but you don't really do anything. And so we believe that compassion has these two elements to it that include not only the feeling, but the action. And we think that's pretty important. So just to feel someone's pain is really not, we feel like, adequate in compassion. One also is then motivated to try to relieve that pain.
The action, I think, is the most important part of that. I think that's one of your major contributions, because I know a lot of people who feel they are compassionate. Maybe, they have their own areas where it pains them to see an animal hurt, or a child that is abused, or, we all have those areas that we're more or less sensitive to, but the action, what is it that we do about that? So let's do this. How do we develop more compassion? How do we go about, incorporating the action behind the feeling?
Right. And so this becomes a complex way of figuring this out. But I think this is very possible. We have good research on this. We've done research myself on some of this. And so part of it begins when kids are really, really young. Part of it involves what kind of environment do they grow up in? What kinds of things do they watch on television and other media and things like that? And we want to create an environment to not only support compassionate feelings, but also compassionate actions. And so what we need is good models, parents, teachers, people that they see in media. So, for example, we see so much competition and cruelty in mass media, shoot 'em up movies, very aggressive, violent kinds of television shows and things of that nature. We need much more shows and engagement that focuses on cooperation and helping. So we know from observational learning, which is a lot of the research of Al Bandura at Stanford, but as well as other folks after his initial studies, demonstrate that we look around and we determine how to think and feel and behave by watching others, like parents when we're really little, and then maybe school peers when we get into school age, and then, of course, mass media. And sadly, mass media likes to push controversy, competition, violence, sexual exploitation, things like this. These are not the messages you want people to absorb and then act on. So we really need a shift so that we model throughout our society not only feeling people's pain, but this is how you act in order to relieve that pain and discomfort.
We've got a hard break coming up here, but when we come back, Professor, I'd like to ask you, if we haven't through this media manipulation that you just discussed, through this entertainment, etc., if we hadn't so desensitized our threshold of arousal that we've actually become addicted to the need for more arousal and therefore more violence. All right. We're speaking with Professor Thomas Plante about his work and book, The Psychology of Compassion and Cruelty. You've heard me recommend it. I believe it is a very timely book. It is very well written, and textbook or lay person, you will enjoy this work. You can learn more about our guest by visiting his website at scu.edu/T-Plante. Plante spelled Plante. Okay, do please stay tuned. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Provocative Enlightenment with Eldon Taylor.
Change has never been easier. Whether you wish to lose weight, stop smoking, build better relationships, become creative, enjoy ultra prosperity, or simply relax and promote self-healing, InnerTalk has been repeatedly demonstrated effective in the most rigorous of scientific studies. Our customers love InnerTalk. Sean wrote, "I have struggled with bulimia for over 30 years and have never been able to lose weight without restoring to it until I used InnerTalk." Vicky wrote, "My hubby has been using the Stop Snoring CD and already his dangerous and raucous snoring levels have stopped." Celeste wrote, "I recently graduated from Taft Law School with honors. I'm writing to tell you how much your InnerTalk CD, Excel in Exams, has helped me. With over 300 titles to choose from, there is something for everyone. Check it out today by going to innertalk.com.
Unlock the power of your mind. This is Provocative Enlightenment with Eldon Taylor.
Welcome back. If you just joined us, we're chatting with Professor Thomas Plante about his work and book, The Psychology of Compassion and Cruelty. You can learn more about our guest by visiting his website at scu.edu/T-Plante. Spell that last name, Plante. Now, we ask our guests for their favorite music that has some true significance to them. Music psychology is a field of research with practical relevance in many areas, including intelligence, creativity, personality, and social behavior. So we just played some of You've Got a Friend by James Taylor. Tell us, Professor, why is this music important to you, and how does it inform us about who you are?
Well, that's a great question. You know, we listen to music and we embrace music that consoles us, soothes us, that gives a message. It's powerful. And in fact, I have one of my regrets in a book that I wrote a few years ago about spiritual practices and psychotherapy, as I talk about 13 tools for integrating spirituality and psychotherapy. And the one tool that I left out was music, because it can be transformative to people in so many ways. And so what we listen to, what we watch, what we eat, what we drink, the air we breathe, all gets incorporated into who we are as a human being. And if you're listening to violent music, aggressive music, disrespectful to other music, you're likely to absorb those messages. If you're listening to, you just played James Taylor's You've Got a Friend, it's more consoling, it's more connecting, it's more we're all in this together kind of music. And I love it myself. And in fact, the very first concert I ever went to when I was a youngster, teenager, was James Taylor in Tanglewood. And the very first concert my own son ever went to was James Taylor and Carole King together a few years back. So I'm a big fan.
That's great. That's a man walks his talk. You'd be surprised sometimes about the folks that are preaching love is all there is, and then the song they choose is, you know, the neighbor done me wrong, the train ran over my dog, Anyway, just on an aside, as I promised before the break, given all the negativity that we're surrounded on in the media and the games, etc., I have sensed that there is a systematic desensitization of our threshold of arousal going on. I remember doing a paper, years ago now, maybe 10 years ago, that had to deal with this, and I used Sylvester Stallone and his in Cold Blood, not In Cold Blood, his Stallone's movies.
Rocky?
No, You Get Even, First Blood, that's it, thank you. And what you saw when you watched this series of, and I believe there were 4 movies now I'm pulling from my mind, was the amount of violence that increased from the first one to the second one to the third one. So, and again, off the top of my head, in the first movie there was maybe 1 killing in, the first 30 minutes. But by the time you got out to the 4th movie, there were 20 or 30 in that same period of time. Do you think that all this negativity has desensitized us, and if so, then does that give rise, one, to us behaving in a less sensitive, less compassionate way, and 2, because we seek arousal, does it create an addictive kind of cycle where we chase even more of the violence?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and it's a question a lot of people have been asking for a long time. And in fact, that's a question that the American Psychological Association has been addressing. In fact, they have just recently approved a white paper that, if it hasn't been published yet, it will be published very, very soon in the American Psychologist, the flagship journal for the American Psychological Association, that talks about the relationship between media exposure to violence and then actual violent acts. And it ends up being a kind of a complicated, not a simple answer. And a lot of it has to do with issues around people who were vulnerable to violence are perhaps more susceptible when they experience violent media. So it's not so much that if a random person watches a shoot 'em up movie or something like that they're going to run out and start being violent, but rather those who tend to be more vulnerable to begin with. We also see this when it comes to pornography. As you know, online pornography is a huge problem that often speaks to violence and things like that, interfaces between sexuality and violence and so forth. And there is some preliminary research regarding the proliferation of online pornography that desensitizes people, that people habituate to a higher level of arousal and so forth, and that becomes problematic in terms of real relationships, real intimate relationships, as opposed to online ones. So that's kind of an emerging, really concerning area as well. And so I think part of the thing we have to do here is to be very thoughtful and mindful of what is the best research telling us about the impact of violence exposure on aggressive behavior and so forth. And there is some good research in that area. And we have to look at the same kind of research when it comes to pornography and other issues around habituation towards more and more stimulation and so forth. And then try to come up with policies and best practices based on that data. For me, and I've always thought this way, even with my own son, who's actually now at this point, he's a college senior at Dartmouth in New Hampshire, and far away from home. We were always extremely careful about what kind of media exposure he had, and I know a lot of other parents are too. And in terms of gaming, aggressive material issues, that movies that he might seen, and to try to provide alternative activities, things like Boy Scouts and other kinds of activities that's maybe more nature-based as opposed to media-based. And so there's a lot of things I think we all can do, regardless of the research where the research is right now, to try to create environments that are less violent, more respectful, more compassionate, and so forth.
Do you, maybe this is a jaded perspective, but do you think that we've passed that tipping point where you can turn things around short of some kind of biblical Armageddon?
That's a great question. It's a tough one because, there are experiences that we all have had and in our culture where people have turned things around based on some story. Let's say, for example, with the clergy abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, it took John Gagan, the priest in Boston, and Cardinal Law in 2002 to all of a sudden unleash a whole movement and momentum to look more thoughtfully and carefully about clergy abuse in the Catholic Church and to do something about it. And I think that ultimately was a moment where things really shifted from top to bottom. We might have seen that again in the Penn State football problem with the assistant coach sexually violating children. That just unleashed a more thoughtful and appropriate way to look at kids who might be sexually being violated in sports. So, right now we're in the middle of this Harvey Weinstein situation in the entertainment industry that has started this Me Too kind of movement across the country and world around sexual victimization of women. So, I am hopeful that when the conditions are right, we do make some important shifts, but there's a lot working against us. Hollywood and media and so forth. They want eyeballs, they want money, they want influence, and when people are more likely to go to shoot 'em up movies than kind of loving, caring movies. People don't necessarily want to see cooperative sport. They want to see aggressive sport. Football and hockey and these kinds of sports are very, very aggressive. If it was up to me, I'd like to see football turn into flag football, although my wife, who's a football fan, rolls her eyes at me when I tell her I'd like professional football to be flag football.
Cool. All right. I've got to ask you this, although I have to choke back my laughter on that one. I think flag football is a good idea, by the way. Recently we have seen a lot of cruelty perpetrated in the name of religion. I think specifically of the hands of some of the religious fanatics, such as videotape beheadings, jihadists, female mutilations, etc., and so forth. And so I have to ask you, as a religious person, as a spiritual person, is religion a positive force in the world or a divisive one? And please unpack the reasoning behind your answer.
Yeah, that's a great question and a wonderful question that so many people ask and have been asking for years. At the end of the day, is religion good for the world or bad for the world? And then probably the short answer is that it's both. It's like a lot of things. A car is a wonderful thing. It gets us where we want to go. But a car in the hands of a drunk driver is a very bad thing. So media is wonderful. Facebook, television, Instagram, and so forth. It can be a wonderful thing. We can stay connected with people who live far away from us who we don't get to see. And it can be a horrific thing when it's being used to propagate, evil and cruelty and things like that. So it's both a good thing and a bad thing. And to unpack that a little bit more carefully, we see that, for example, and based on some really good research from a fellow named Professor Jones at Rutgers in New Jersey, looks at we look at sacred values. When sacred values are impacted, are disrespected, people can really kind of lose it. And that's what we're seeing in some of this religious-based violence. We also see it in some of this patriotic-based kind of violence, too. Desecrating the flag, for example, or currently, back to football, where if the players don't stand for the national anthem, it's really set some people off. And this whole notion is that when we have something that we believe is sacred, whether it be our religious tradition, religious scripture, whether it be our religious point of view or patriotic points of view or whatever, racial points of view, then that gives us the justification to get violent. So, for example, if someone desecrates, let's say, the Quran, that's a sacred document to those from the Islamic tradition. It may not be a sacred document to people who are not from the Islamic tradition. And so if somebody does something like destroy the Quran or set fire to it. That's going to set some people off. And we see that, let's say, in the Christian tradition, to desecrate, let's say, the crucifix or the Virgin Mary or Jesus in general, or this is going to set some people off. Or in the Jewish tradition, desecrating, let's say, the Torah or a synagogue or something like that. That can set people off. So wherever we see sacred values and behaviors and traditions that get disrespected, dissed, then we're in trouble. And religion tends to be a ripe place for that. So one of the ways to work around that, and this is what I come to a lot, is that if you treat everyone respectfully and compassionately, and both are necessary, it's not just compassion, but you got to add respect in there too, then we're less likely to find ourselves in these polarized ways of being. Even though we may not agree with people for different points of view, even if they're overly aggressive or what have you, if we can at least respect them as human beings, that's half the battle. A lot of people, ISIS and others who behave in such violent ways, a lot of them feel really dissed. And dissed means feeling disrespected. If you can at least respect them as human beings, try to understand their point of view. You may not agree with it, but you try to understand that point of view, offer some compassion. I think we'd move the ball a lot more forward than we are now. And religion can be a force of good in this if it's managed well.
Let's take the sacred for a minute. It seems to me that part of the secular progressive movement is this notion of relativism. Mm-hmm. And wherever I go, no matter where I speak, whoever, there's going to be people there who don't believe in sacred as in the tradition you and I might think. I mean, sacred would mean truth. It would mean of extraordinary value, etc. In the world of relativism, people that carry out according to, well, let's say the fellow that cuts the teenage girl's ears off because she failed to please him after he purchased her in Pakistan. Where I'm affronted by that, you would be affronted by that. Relativism says, well, that's their values. That's the way they live. How do you see this relativism impacting the very nature of what we call or hold sacred?
Right, terrific question, and it's a great, I teach an ethics class, which I'll be teaching actually in a few minutes here, where we talk about this very issue that, yes, cultural relativism is one approach to trying to figure out what's right and wrong, what's ethical and not ethical, and some cultures or some communities out there do things that we would find very egregious, let's say cutting off the ears of a young woman or something like that, or let's say a female circumcision, or honor killings and things like that. Yeah. And so we would say that, look, there's a lot of different approaches to ethics and morality and things like that. Cultural relativism is only one. We also have utilitarianism and absolute moral rules and certain virtues and values and justice and so forth. And that we need to be thoughtful in terms of looking at a wide variety of approaches to come up with good solutions. And that we would say that sometimes certain ethical principles globally and universally trump others. So there have been efforts over the years of having an emphasis on world ethics, global ethics. And there are some principles that have emerged out of that effort, including things: you don't murder people. Yes, people might kill each other in war and in self-defense, but you don't murder people. Another one is to take care of young children. You don't exploit young children. You nurture and you take care of them. And so there's a variety of global ethical principles that basically cultures across the world have said, yeah, we agree with that. So I agree. We can't say cultural relativism is the end all in terms of solving moral, ethical problems. It's just one approach. And sometimes we say there's other approaches that are going to trump it. Just like, for example, people from other countries across the world might come to the United States and say, well, hey, in my culture, it's okay for me to beat up my children if they don't act well. Or in my culture, women shouldn't have access to health care or education, and they can't drive a car. And we say, well, as long as you're living in the United States, you can't do that because we have other principles and laws and so forth that trump cultural relativism.
Yeah. I guess I don't share your optimism there. I think cultural relativism is an escape mechanism for justifying anything and everything. But that's just me.
I would agree with that. I think that often that is the case. People can say, hey, in my culture, it's okay for me to do this and that, and that may justify behavior that is very egregious. So I certainly wouldn't disagree with you with that.
Thank you, sir. Let's address competition for a moment. For Ayn Rand, competition is not only natural, it is necessary. People compete for everything, from the house they wish to buy to the job they're seeking, for the grades they get in school, to graduate training, on and on and on, including for our mates. That said, competition is often viewed as unworthy of the loftier side of man, and as such, many schools award everyone a ribbon, so there are no losers. Professor, three-part question. What is your long view on the nature of competition? Is it inherently something we wish to minimize or eliminate? And if so, how do we go about doing that?
Well, this is a great question. It's a wonderful question, and it's and part of it is you can't avoid competition. The question is, how do we compete? And so, for example, we have a globe that has 7 billion people on it, and quickly approaching 8 billion. We've got a country that has 325 million Americans, and there's only so many jobs. There's only so many slots in selective colleges. There's only so many potential mates out there. We have businesses that compete with one another. And so inevitably, competition is part of the human condition, and it always has been and probably always will be. And yet, how do we compete with one another? And this is what's so important if we think about respect and compassion always, under all circumstances, and to try to do competition, engage in competition without demonizing the others. And so we try to teach kids this in sports, hockey and soccer games and football games and baseball games and so forth. And certain sports try to really, for example, we have what's called the Positive Coaching Alliance, which is an organization that really tries to support good sportsmanship and things of that nature. My son is a track guy. He runs track in college. And I'm always very pleased that he's a 400 runner, after the competition, regardless how he does or his peers do, they all shake hands together. They all wish each other well. And there's no real animosity that I have experienced, at least in collegiate track meets for sprinters, for example, which is what I would focus on. And I think we have to use those good sportsmanship principles as best we can in order to look at competition, globally. And sure, there's going to be winners and losers, but if we treat everybody with respect, if we treat everyone with compassion, we will sometimes be the winner, sometimes be the loser, and that's okay.
Yes, it is okay. That's how life is, I suppose. Professor, you're a prominent proponent of do the right thing. We've only got about 30 seconds, and this is horrible of me to ask you with that time constraint, but how do we know what the right thing is?
That's a great question, and it's something that we're always reflecting and discerning about. If we're thoughtful people, if we want to do the right thing, then we want to reflect on our decisions. We want to talk to others about it, get consultation. We want some tools that are out there, readings that we can do, interactions with groups that are supportive, loved ones, and so forth. And we want to ultimately discern to figure out who are we we and who do we want to become? Every decision we make, whether we're intentional or not, is answering the question, who am I and who do I want to become? We want people to have tools to help to reflect and discern, to make those answers good answers, and to keep learning as we do so that we're always working at this. This is something we're never finished with. We're always working at. We want simple principles. People have different points of view about what those principles are. I tend to like the whole respect and compassion thing. I think it organizes and centers how I operate in my life, and it may help organize and center how other people operate in their life.
I want to thank you, Professor, for your work and for your willingness to share it with us. The Psychology of Compassion and Cruelty. Go get the book. We've come to the end of another episode of Provocative Enlightenment. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed our show and will join us again next week. Till then, remember, believing in yourself always matters.
Provocative Enlightenment has been brought to you by Progressive Awareness Research and other sponsors. Provocative Enlightenment is a syndicated show and appears on other networks. For a schedule of show times, visit provocativeenlightenment.com. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, write to Eldon at eldontaylor.com.